where involves a super sophisticated surveillance software that kind of drives the echelon satellite systems that spy on us and all sorts of other things.
Mm-hmm.
But it was given to Brian so that Brian could sell it to police agencies around the world, and this would include the CIA, the Mossad, Interpol, the ISI. All these people bought versions of the Promise software from Earl Brian, and Earl Brian profiteered from this, made a fortune selling this software.
Right.
Unfortunately, it had been stolen from a client of the government. It was actually developed by a company called Inslaw, and that's why this is known as the Inslaw case.
Right.
Inslaw had created Promise. Its origins actually were going back to the Vietnam War to track the Viet Cong. A guy named Bill Hamilton developed it, and he developed a version of it actually for the police board here in St. Louis. And its whole point and purpose was to be able to effectively track the enemy, whether it was the Viet Cong or whether it was, a criminal through various prosecutors' offices. That's why it's called Promise, the Prosecutor Management Information System. So that you could tell, if there was a criminal who had been picked up, you could tell where he was in the system. You could feed it all this information, and you could pretty much second guess his next move better than any kind of fortune teller. That was the great thing about the Promise software, was its prognostication capability, its ability to project the next thing an enemy might do.
Right. Wow. So this did. I mean, if you were selling this to all these different departments and so forth, did that mean that these departments could have access to even satellite footage and information coming from U.S. military systems, things like this?
Yeah, well, it's a very malleable code. It's several million lines of code, and it was used to do a number of things. They used to have difficulty tracking Soviet submarines through the Arctic ice, for instance. With the Promise software, made that a lot easier, the way they applied it there. But the nefarious thing about the Promise software was that once it was sold to a client, it was sold with a backdoor capacity, a secret backdoor capacity. So that is, Earl Brian, working, of course, for Western intelligence, Central Intelligence, not necessarily the CIA, but working for the United States, was illegally selling and profiteering this software to its clients, and the clients were getting, not knowing it, were getting the ability for that Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S., to spy on them. Backdoor capacity. So, it serves them right because they were buying it illegally in the first place.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
But in addition to profiteering from it, we got a whole system in which we could spy on other people spying on other people.
Oh, my God. So do you think that Earl Brian then was a front actually used by the CIA or some kind of Western intelligence in this case?
The Octopus. He was working for the Octopus, right?
Right.
The Octopus was Castellero's term for this power group that was a transnational power group that, at its core, had a bunch of people from the OSS after World War II who had come together basically to further their own greed and their own power interests above and beyond anything that anyone loyal to the United States would want to do, for instance. So, a transnational conspiracy of global proportions.
And I
of course,
guess
made Castellero. That's kind of different than having the kind of armchair approach to trying to figure out who shot Kennedy, kind of a thing.
Right.
Castellero was sticking his finger on the pulse of the big monster that runs the world.
He went for the guys that are never seen in the public, those who we never heard the names of, right?
That's right, yeah, and he used them, and he collected their names, and he was actually, even though he was creating a fictional work, he had totally intended on putting those names in there. And when he talked to henchmen and assassins and people involved in the conspiracy, from their point of view, see, this was his big mistake. From their point of view, it didn't matter to them whether he was writing a book of fiction. All they knew was that there was this guy snooping around.
Right.
So eventually he was going to get whacked. What happened?
And this was just, I guess, the Promise software and the whole Inslaw case here. This was just I guess, one way into the entire network of the Octopus here, I guess, then.
That's right. That's precisely right. And it's kind of like the main thing. One interesting side note to all this is that at one point there was a television program in America, maybe you got it there, I don't know, called The Lone Gunman.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It was like an offshoot of the X-Files.
Sure.
The X-Files series, right?
Yeah.
and it had three guys who were publishing a zine, right? You know, and I'd always pointed out to people before that these guys were me and Jim Martin and Greg Bishop, the three guys who were doing the three main conspiracy zines, trying to make us look ridiculous.
Right.
Well, the very first episode of that show, and I didn't realize this actually until much later. I taped it and I didn't watch it because I taped it because I'd heard that its plot involved something called the Octium chip, right? Octopus, Octium. And the Octium chip in the show was a piece of software that had backdoor access. They were obviously using the ideas that they picked up from the Octopus book, which was weird enough, you know, that, you know, what I'm doing, I'm watching on television. But the same episode, the very same episode became real famous in the conspiracy circuit because later in the program, an airplane is headed toward the trade towers. And this is in the March preceding 9/11.
Right.
They had the whole scenario set up where this plane was going to crash into the trade towers. And they turn it around at the last minute using the promised software. So this whole scenario was getting played out on national television in the March preceding when it actually did happen. You know,
so
it wasn't turned away and we had 9/11.
What was the promised software actually mentioned in that episode?
It was called the Octium chip.
Okay, the Octium chip, but they didn't refer to it as Promise in the series.
Promise, but it acted just like Promise.
Right.
Or access.
Yeah, right.
The Octium reference and all that other stuff. It was kind of an oblique reference.
Very interesting indeed. So, I mean, wasn't it Chris Carter who's behind Lone Gunman 2, wasn't it?
Yes, it was Chris Carter.
Yeah. Yeah, he's an interesting guy for sure. He's got his finger on the pulse.
All these people, you know, and this was, you know, at one time it was almost common. There was another program called Dark Skies.
Yeah.
Which was on the Science Fiction Channel, which mixed up a lot of historical figures into this plot about MJ-12 and the aliens. Well, one week at steamshovelpress.com, I would do a column about Dorothy Kilgallen and her connection to the Kennedy assassination. The very next week, Dorothy Kilgallen was a character in that show. And then the next week, I write this article about Carl Sagan, who at one time argued before a rocket association that there were alien artifacts on the far side of the moon. And I put this in a column, and the next week in that show, Dark Skies, Carl Sagan was a character. He'd been conscripted by MJ-12.
Right.
And Mel Gibson did a whole movie on conspiracy theory that and everything that cab driver is talking about in that movie all comes out of Steam Shovel Press because the writer, Brian Helgelin, I think his name was, had bought the book had bought the anthology. There are two anthologies of Steam Shovel Press, one of them called Popular Alienation, and the writer bought that book from Jim Martin in Flatland. So I got my $2 royalty for the book, and how many hundreds of thousands of dollars did Mel Gibson make off that? Right. Tell me there are no conspiracies.
Right. I mean, but this is interesting because we've discussed this before on the show that many writers, I think, to this day have a field day, so to speak, on the web that they're gathering a lot of information. In this case, obviously, it came from a book. But do you think that this means that they are paying close attention to your work and using it, or do you think that this is a synchronicity because the information itself actually want to get out, so to speak?
Well, the definition of synchronicity, of course, is a meaningful coincidence.
Right.
So it may be a coincidence, but the meaningful part is really the kind of scary part. I'm sure they do monitor what kinds of information gets put out into the popular culture at any given time. And I used to have this discussion with Jim Keith. It would come. We did a chapter on. We did a reference to Abbie Hoffman. Do you know Abbie Hoffman, the '60s radical figure?
Well, wasn't he the guy who was allegedly behind the whole LSD, dissemination? Albert Hoffman, right?
No, that's Albert Hoffman.
Albert
Hoffman took LSD and took the famous bicycle ride, the first LSD trip. That was Albert.
Right.
Abbie Hoffman was a member of the Chicago Seven.
Okay.
He was the '60s radical guy who was very popular dissenter in America.
Mm-hmm.
And he supposedly committed suicide, although there were a lot of questions about that. And at the very least, if he did commit suicide, it was because of partly because of pain that he was experiencing in his back after an auto accident that he got into when a truck forced his car off the road when he was trying to deliver a story about the Inslaw case to Playboy magazine. Okay, so a lot of people suspect that he was killed, just like Casolaro. And the conversation with Keith went along the lines of, well, look, if they killed Casolaro and if they've killed Abby Hoffman, and Keith would say, Ken, how come they're not coming after us?
Right.
First point to be made is this is not a conversation I can have with Jim Keith anymore, now is it?
No, exactly.
Yeah, and the second point is that, why don't they just outright kill everybody who's a political dissenter? Just send hitmen out to every one of them.
Right.
And the answer is really because they have, they have a big program going on. There's a laughter curtain in the media. You try to talk about conspiracies in the American media, they will just laugh at you.
Right.
So that's one way that they keep dissent in control. By those means, there are financial means. There's all kinds of ways of getting at people, and different things happen at different times. So,
right. Well, I guess that they're also kind of the how should I put it? It's a need or a use for certain types of this information to exist within society, and as you said, this can be used either to make an example for other people. This is these are an example of in quotes here the kooks. You know what I mean?
Right, precisely.
Yeah.
And I've heard people make the arguments that things like the Zapruder film, for instance, were actually created. The Zapruder film of the assassination of JFK.
Right. Yeah.
That was actually created for the very purpose of being able to play it over and over again in the media to remind, people in the country that, hey, we can do this to anybody we want, anytime we want, and that it has kept, certain control via fear that way.
It's a communication or a signal that is targeted more on the subconscious level, perhaps, that when people watch this, they're on some level supposed to know that, okay, there are some really, big guys around here that absolutely have full control of the entire situation, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, particularly since I've been doing my work, conspiracy itself has been a theme in the popular culture. X-Files and Lone Gunmen are just a couple of examples where
sure.
People know that what's being said in these movies is fiction, is entertainment. It's a horror show one way or another. But on the other hand, it's also reflective of things that are really going on.
Right.
So I don't know who made the point about the best way to keep a conspiracy covered up is to put it out in full view of everybody.
Well, exactly, because
I think that's what happens.
Yeah, because in that case, every single time someone would refer to that story or that conspiracy, people would automatically revert to the idea that no, that's just a movie, or you're delusional,
That's exactly right.
That's just a story, There's nothing real about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of people just tell themselves.
Of course. So, I mean, do you think if we kind of go back a little bit and talk about the general outline, I guess, of the octopus, as you refer to it, the hidden power behind all the other hidden powers within government, so to speak. Would you say, at this point that you have kind of figured out what the main agenda is, what's the purpose of the group is, what's their goal? Any ideas, theories that you want to share with us about that?
Well, I mean, you could talk about it in kind of general terms. There's shifting agendas, different things to be done at different times. Maybe its biggest expression was the 9/11 event itself, which a lot of people have characterized as, having been done by the Bush administration itself. There are people out there who don't even believe, for instance, that Al-Qaeda is real, that it's some kind of creation of our own Western intelligence. And,
right.
You can see in the historical record, you can see that its earliest incarnations were, in fact, funded by the U.S. Zbigniew Brzezinski says this in his memoirs.
That's right.
Started funding the Mujahideen before even the Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Which was supposedly their purpose, and that you can take the money and run with it. I don't go all the way there with all these people. I'm not a person, for instance, that doesn't believe or believes that no plane hit the Pentagon. I know the Pentagon was hit by a plane. It's
how do you know that?
Fact, but
how do you know that?
Clear. What's that?
How do you know that?
Well, let's see.